Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing our final gubernatorial prediction ahead of the midterm elections, which are tomorrow. And of course, tomorrow we're going to be having our election night live stream. Link down below in the description. Also link down below to the Discord if you're interested in joining that live stream. But anyway, we'll get straight into it. We've got a lot of races to cover. Of course, the gubernatorial contests are a lot more competitive than the Senate ones. They're less nationalized, so some of these are going to be state specific. So we're going to get through all of these states in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Forgot to fill in California. We'll start off with the state of Oregon. Now, this was a state that originally, for a while, the Republicans were actually pulling ahead. And one of the reasons why they were pulling ahead was because of an independent candidate by the name of Betsy Johnson, who really was disproportionately taking votes away from the Democrat Tina Kotek. Betsy Johnson in the state legislature was a Democrat. She was more of a Manchin conservative Democrat type. But regardless, she ended up taking a lot of votes away from Kotek. And as the race sort of went on, and really in the final stretch of this race, her support has sort of been drifting away. She's been losing a lot of her voters, and ultimately now in the polls, she's at 8, 9, 10%. She's lost a lot of money, a lot of fundraising, and as a result, she's sort of fallen out of favor, especially as a lot of voters realize she's not really viable anymore, maybe like she was early on in the race when she was polling pretty competitively against the top two contenders. So that's something we have to factor into this race. Honestly, it really is a tough race to call. 538 has Kotek up by 3 points. Real Clear Politics has her up by 1.3. It's tough because if Johnson really is taking these votes away from Kotek and those Johnson voters show up and still stick by Johnson, then Drazen will probably win. I mean, if we take a look at Oregon, this isn't exactly a state that's very competitive on the federal level, but statewide, it's a much more competitive race, especially when you had Governor Kate Brown in office, who really wasn't that popular. I mean, this was during a blue wave year around the country, and Kate Brown won by less than 7% in a blue state that usually votes for Democrats by around 16 points nationally speaking. So in terms of this race, it's tough to categorize. I've originally given Drazen the benefit of the doubt, but these latest polls are sort of indicative of a trend that we've been seeing, and that is that Betsy Johnson has been taking away votes from Drazen. Drazen could still win, but I actually think Kotek is the slight favorite in Oregon this time around. Moving on down to Nevada, you of course have Democrat incumbent Steve Sisolak going up against Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo. The polls in this race have been a lot better for Lombardo, even in Democratic-leaning polls. Data for Progress is more of a, they're Democratic-leaning, but their numbers tend to be very accurate. They've got Lombardo up by 2. A lot of the recent polls have Lombardo up over the past couple of weeks. As I've said in previous predictions, I think he's going to win. I think he'll probably win by around 2 to 3 points. That's going to be a lean flip in the state of Nevada. Even 538 predicts that Lombardo is going to win this race, so I'm pretty confident in that. Moving on down to Arizona, Kari Lake going up against the Democratic Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs. Katie Hobbs really hasn't been running much of a campaign, which really has angered a lot of Democrats since she hasn't really been going out speaking to voters. She refuses to debate Kari Lake, and ultimately it's hurt her electorally to the point where now Lake is up in the Real Clear Politics average by 2 points. She's up by 2.5 on 538. I think Kari Lake's going to win. I think she's going to win by more than expected, mainly because there are only 2 candidates on the ballot. So if Kari Lake really is polling at 52%, I mean, a 52-48 margin right there by Data for Progress, that's a 4-point margin for Kari Lake because there's only 2 candidates in the race. I think Kari Lake wins by 4 to 5. I think she's going to win pretty comfortably, and she'll probably carry Blake Masters over the finish line. If you haven't seen my Senate prediction, link to that at the end of this video. Alaska's got a really weird system. I think Dunleavy's going to win, though, by a likely margin. They've got the whole ranked choice system. I think Governor Dunleavy is going to be reelected. Moving on up to Colorado, I think Jared Polis, who the incumbent Democratic governor, he's very popular. I think he's going to win by a decent amount. He's up by 11 points in the polls. It's possible he could underperform these, especially given the midterm environment and also the fact that he's going to be sharing a ballot with Michael Bennet, who hasn't been doing as well, but I'm sure Polis will get some crossover support. I don't think he's going to win by as much as Joe Biden back in 2020. I don't know how much of a landslide this will be. I think it's going to be 10 or 11 points. I'm going to put this in the likely category. Not exactly safe. I had it as safe previously, but I think the wave will sort of put this more into the likely category. But Ganal really hasn't been pulling that well. I mean, she finally started pulling at 43%, but she's still down considerably. Even Trafalgar has her down by 7 points, so a likely margin in Colorado. Down in New Mexico, we've got Michelle Lujan Grisham, the incumbent governor, versus Republican Mark Ronchetti. If we take a look at the polls in this race, they've tightened pretty considerably. In fact, the latest polls out of Emerson have Michelle Lujan Grisham up by just 2 points, and there's one that has her up by 3. This was a race that the last time around I actually had going to the Democrats. I think it's possible that Ronchetti could pull an upset. Now, this really is a true toss-up because on the one hand, New Mexico is a decently blue state, but on the other hand, in these off-year elections, it does have a rich history of switching out the party for governor roughly every 8 years. Of course, in this case, this would be a little bit of an exception. If you went back to 2018, of course, you wouldn't think this because Michelle Lujan Grisham won in a landslide back in 2018. She won by nearly 18 percentage points. I'm tempted at this point, given the latest Emerson poll that we have. I'm gonna go on a hunch and narrowly give this to Ronchetti. Now, this could be totally wrong. Again, this is a toss-up. I think this can go either way. But if Emerson has this race this close, and Emerson's a poll I really trust a lot, I think Ronchetti could end up winning. He is a strong candidate. I think the national wins probably will carry him over the top. This could be considered somewhat of an upset because early on, Ronchetti looked like he was on track to win, and then he sort of had a lull in this period. Now I think he looks like he might be the favorite again. So last prediction before Election Day, I think Ronchetti wins very narrowly. Moving on up to the state of Kansas, you've got incumbent Governor Laura Kelly against Derek Schmidt, the popular Attorney General. This race really also could go either way. In fact, Emerson College, which I don't think has polled Kansas very much, has Laura Kelly in the lead. It looks like she may end up holding on, although I will say Kansas is a much more red partisan state than, say, Louisiana when it comes to statewide offices. But Kansas does have a history, like New Mexico, of electing and re-electing Democratic governors pretty often, even though it is a red state overall. So this is a tough race to categorize. I think based on the national environment, Schmidt probably wins by a lean margin, but if Kelly were to win in this election, I wouldn't be that surprised. Moving on down to Oklahoma. Now, this is a state I never thought I'd be talking about when it came to somewhat competitive gubernatorial contests, but Kevin Stitt is really not a popular governor, and in fact, he's put a lot of people against him throughout his tenure as governor, to the point where a competent Democrat could potentially beat him if Oklahoma was a bluer state. Again, you go back to 2018 with Mary Phelan, who was the former governor there. When she left office, Kevin Stitt still won by 12 points, despite her being incredibly unpopular. And now the polling in this race has been more competitive. I think Stitt's going to hold on. I think it's going to be a likely margin at the end of the day. I think the national environment will help him. Also, Oklahoma is just such a red state. I mean, when you take a look at some of these counties, even in this election result, even Oklahoma City going decisively to the Democrat here, Tulsa's still red, and of course the rural counties are blood red. So I think Stitt holds on. I think he holds on by a likely margin. Down in Texas, this is a race I've gone back and forth on in terms of what the margin would be. I've had it as safe. I've had it as likely. Looking at the polls the day before the election, Abbott is up by 9 in the polls. He's built on his lead, especially in the final weeks of the campaign. I think he's going to win by a safe margin. I easily could see a 12 to 13 point victory for Abbott. The Republicans have been doing very well in the early vote there, in Harris County and other parts of the state. I think he's going to win pretty comfortably at the end of the day, which will come as a shock because many saw Beto, Democrats anyway, saw him as a very strong challenger. And ultimately, I think the national environment and Greg Abbott's popularity is going to doom him in this contest. Moving on up to the North Star state. Minnesota is not a state I've ever ranked going to the Republicans in terms of the governorship before. Taking a look at some of the latest polls we have, Survey USA is not exactly reliable. Trafalgar has Jensen leading. I don't really see an upset in this race. I think Walz will hold on, probably by 4 to 5 points. Minnesota is one of those states that tends to be sort of immune to wave years. Of course, in 2010, you had the governorship going to the Democrat. Of course, 2014 as well, pretty comfortably. So I don't really see an upset here. I could see other Republicans winning potentially in the Attorney General's race. Keith Ellison is certainly very vulnerable, but I think at the top of the ticket, I think Walz will hang on. Over in the state of Wisconsin, polling has shifted in this race quite considerably. Originally, the incumbent Tony Evers was favored, and now the latest polls have the Republican Tim Michels up in the RCP average barely. This is a race now for a few months, or really the entire cycle, I've predicted will go to the Republicans. Wisconsin is a very, very purple state. In fact, it was one of the closest states back in 2020, the fourth closest state. Donald Trump only lost this by 0.6%. I think given the fact that Evers doesn't really have any major accomplishments under his belt, I've said this many times when I talk about this race, he's been stonewalled by the Republican-controlled legislature. So, not really his fault per se that he can't get a lot of his agenda passed, but I think ultimately voters aren't really going to see him as effective. And unfortunately for the Democrats, they're going to lose this race by a lean margin. I think Michels will win by 3, and I think Johnson probably wins by 6. Moving on down to Illinois. Now, I'm actually moving Illinois out of the safe category, and I'll explain why in one word, and that is turnout. I think downstate Republicans are going to turn out really big in Illinois, and even though it's a state that I don't think has a realistic chance of flipping at all, I think Pritzker's going to win pretty comfortably. I think it's going to be a likely margin. I think Pritzker will probably win by around 10 points or so. Bailey has the potential to get 43% of the vote, especially given the fact that I think he'll have a very strong performance downstate. That's the area where he's from. He's very much running a campaign that would be widely liked in the downstate area. And I think even in the Chicago suburbs, he's going to chip away at some of these margins, especially in DeKalb County, Kendall County, these areas that barely went to Biden. I think they're going to swing back. I think they're going to swing against Pritzker. But at the end of the day, he's still going to win by around 10 points. Now, up in Michigan, now this is a race that potentially could have an insurgent upset with Tudor Dixon, although we take a look at some of the polls here. I believe Whitmer is up 4.4% in the RCP average. That seems like a big lead to an extent, but given that Michigan polls are very Democratic leaning and they tend to oversample Democrats, it's not exactly the largest lead she could have, although Tudor Dixon has never led in a single poll besides Wick Insights back in early October. Ultimately, I think Whitmer will pull through. I think it's going to be a close race. I think she'll pull through by less than 2 points. But I think Whitmer will end up winning. And of course, if she doesn't, I wouldn't be too surprised. Again, this is tilt, so her victory would be under 2 percentage points. So if Tudor Dixon did pull an upset, I wouldn't be totally shocked. But I think Whitmer does have the advantage in this race slightly. Moving on up to Maine. Now, this potentially could be a dark horse in terms of a race that we don't really think is competitive, and it ends up being competitive. Janet Mills is up by 7 points in the 538 average. LePage has not pulled close in really any of these polls. In fact, he's not even within the margin of error in any of these. Maine is a state that's really bad at polling. They severely mispolled the Senate race back in 2020. They had Gideon up by 8. Susan Collins ended up winning by 8. So, again, Susan Collins is an incumbent, different factors at play, but Maine polls aren't exactly that good. I do think Janet Mills has an advantage. I'm going to put it as a lean, but potentially you could see a sleeper flip in Maine. Moving on down to Rhode Island. Interesting factors in this race as well. Dan McKee, the incumbent Democratic governor, is not popular. He also barely won his primary election back in September. In fact, he only won by around 3 points. So he almost lost a primary as an incumbent governor. We really don't have any general election polling on this race. Given the fundamentals of the midterms and given the fact that Dan McKee is not popular, given the fact that Ashley Kalus, I think, is running a pretty good campaign, I'm going to put this as likely Democrat. I don't think it's going to be safe. I think you're going to see significant third-party voting in this race, but ultimately, I don't think Kalus is going to win, but it will be somewhat close. Same with the state of Connecticut. I think Stefanowski will get within a likely margin, but I don't expect him to win. He's been running a very lazy campaign this time around, very opposite of his 2018 campaign where he was crisscrossing the state, really campaigning hard. He really hasn't done that this time, and he's down by an incredible amount in a lot of the polling. Ultimately, I think the national environment will make this a likely margin race, but I don't see Stefanowski winning. Over in New York, now this is probably the toughest race to categorize in my opinion because New York is so heavily dependent on turnout. As I tweeted out earlier today on Twitter, there's 3 ways the New York governor's race could go. The first one would be that the polls are oversampling Republicans and, Hochul wins by a safe margin. The second is that the polls are pretty on point. Hochul wins by around 6 to 8, around where the polls say. And then, of course, the third is that polls are really missing the turnout differential in this race. Either Hochul wins narrowly or Zeldin wins narrowly. I'm going to go with the safe bet. I'm going to go in the middle. I'm going to say this is a likely Democratic race. But don't be surprised if you get a really strange result out of New York. Now, again, I'm predicting 8 to 10 purely because you've only got 2 candidates on the ballot. So even if Zeldin gets 44%, which is extremely high for a Republican in New York, he still loses by 12 points because you've got Hochul getting 56. So ultimately, I think it's going to be a little closer than that. I'm going to put it as likely Democratic right now. But I will say I'm not that confident just because there are conflicting reports about the early vote and the turnout that we're seeing. Turnout is very high in red areas, Long Island, upstate. It's very low in the city. Potentially you could see an upset, but right now I'm going to go with my brain on this and go likely Democratic. Although my gut tells me this is a race a lot of people are sleeping on. Down in Pennsylvania, you have Doug Mastriano, the state senator, versus Attorney General Josh Shapiro. This is a race that really could have been very winnable for the GOP. I think had the nominee had been different and had the Republican Governors Association funded that nominee, I think this race would have been a lot closer. In fact, I think Republicans probably could have won this race. But given the state of the race now, I don't really see a Mastriano upset possible. If it does happen, it would probably be one of the biggest polling misses in history. I certainly think it's going to be a lot closer than Shapiro plus 12. I think it's going to be lean Democrat, Shapiro plus 5. I don't really see a 6 to 8 point margin for Shapiro, especially with Oz pulling ahead in the Senate race. I'd be surprised if there were that many split ticketers. I know their split ticket voting is very popular in Pennsylvania, but it's not in New Hampshire or Vermont. So I'm going to put that as lean Democratic. Down in Georgia, I think Kemp wins very comfortably. I think it's about an 8 point margin for Kemp. I think the polls are going to be pretty spot on. And I do think that's going to help Walker over the finish line. Again, this race, early on, I thought Kemp was in trouble, especially when he fell out of the good graces of Donald Trump. But ultimately, he made his own brand in the state. He's pulling together his own coalition of suburban moderates, Asians, Latinos, and, you know, he's got a winning coalition in the state. And ultimately, I think he's going to do very well. I think he's going to win Cobb County. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't do my graphics for this prediction. I had graphics sort of made or planned for every one of these states by county, so it would have been interesting. I did that in my 2020 prediction. Unfortunately, I can't do that. I ran out of time, but perhaps maybe next election we'll have something like that. Finally, down in Florida, I think DeSantis is going to win big. I think you could even see a 15-point margin of victory for DeSantis, which sounds crazy, but when you look at the early vote data and the polling, DeSantis is up by 11 points in the RCP average. Republicans are on track to win Miami-Dade County. Charlie Crist really was a very poor candidate, really didn't run on anything, really just ran against Ron DeSantis. And ultimately, Ron DeSantis is a fundraising juggernaut. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Crist, I think, raised in the single of millions of dollars. So this race wasn't going to be close by the fundraising. Ron DeSantis is going to win comfortably tomorrow. So that is it. That's my final gubernatorial prediction for the midterms. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, leave a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Of course, link down below to the Discord and the live stream 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.